Well, hello, I'm Caroline Warman, and I'm one of the tutors in modern languages at Jesus. And if you've watched the video that I did with the students about our course, you'll already have met me. And I want to introduce you here to Katrin Kohl, another of our tutors who teaches German normally, but is currently leading a huge and exciting project called Creative Multilingualism. So I'm going to ask her some questions about it. Katrin, can you tell us what creative multilingualism is?
So creative multilingualism was devised in response to a call from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is the funding body for research in the sort of main amount of research money that goes into the humanities and arts. And they wanted a lot of universities across the country to do some thinking about what modern languages is in the 21st century and how it might be rather different from what it had been previously. And so they left it very open to different universities to come up with different ideas for how to approach this. And they offered a large amount of money, so about £3.5 million for these projects. And we came up in Oxford, and then also with partners elsewhere, with the idea of creative multilingualism. In fact, it was invented by Jane Hiddleston, who's a French tutor in another college. And the reason we found this idea exciting is because it connects creativity with language diversity. So the idea that we don't just all speak one language, we speak lots of languages across the world, and that this is a source of creativity. But one reason why we were keen on this is because we were getting a bit frustrated with the idea that languages are promoted only as something that's really useful. So, you know, you do it because it's useful for this, useful for that. You can go abroad, you can order a cup of coffee in the language, but actually increasingly now that people will tend to, in tourist centers, certainly speak a lot of English, it's less useful. So what we were looking at is really where's the value of languages beyond that, and creativity we thought was a very interesting area to look at.
Oh, and so you said that it was not just based at Oxford, is it? Can you tell us where else it is based?
So what we had to do was, on the one hand, we were competing with lots of other universities because everybody wanted a slice of this money. And at the same time, we were also, part of the whole project was that we should get together with other universities and also with other sorts of external partners and create something much bigger that wasn't just about an individual person's research, but something much more collaborative. And so we're collaborating with 5 other universities, so that Birmingham City University, Reading, Cambridge, SOAS, which is in London, part of London University, where they teach a very large range of languages, and Pittsburgh University. I can't remember that one now, but anyway.
I think you have.
And then we also have a lot of external partners, and they range from the British Council to GCHQ, which is quite cool because they do things like spying and worrying about spies from elsewhere. And we work with an organisation called BirdLife International, so there's a conservation aspect to our work, and lots of schools, so a wide range of other partners that we've been working with as well.
Sounds wonderful. I mean, and can you you've told us about the creativity bit, but can you tell us what it aims to do?
So what we're aiming to do is to really, I guess our starting point has been that we're all multilingual in some ways. So even though the UK sees itself as very monolingual, we're very multicultural. Everybody accepts that we're very multicultural. And those many different cultures tend to go together with very different languages that have come into the UK over centuries. English was crafted out of bits of Germanic, Nordic languages, French, and so on. English would not be what it is today if it weren't for many, many, many imports, and they're happening all the time. And the Oxford English Dictionary is continually including new words from other languages, African languages, Indian languages, and so on. But what we were also then looking at is how do we capture that? And one of the things we've been working, for instance, with a lot of artists in Birmingham, where one of our partners is based, Birmingham City University, and they're doing a lot of work with an organization called Punch Records. So we've got some quite cool artists who are sort of rappers and sort of sign language, stand-up comedian. We're looking at slang, so there's a project within the work they're doing up there in Birmingham called Slangwages, where they're looking at how, say in rap, you would be drawing on street language, urban language, transforming that into something that then becomes a creative way of articulating, of expressing identity and of generating a response. So I was working with, just to sort of give an indication of how some of the projects have emerged, my research interest is metaphor. And so I used to work on metaphor primarily in relation to German and in poetry, whereas now I've been looking more at the kind of cognitive side of metaphor, so how we think metaphorically and how it helps us to think abstractly, like even in physics, if you're talking about a black hole, that's a metaphor. And we were doing a conference, and 4 students came from Brampton Manor Academy in East London, because their very enterprising teacher thought that they might be interested in this conference on metaphor, this research conference. So then I got talking to them, and one of them was a Yoruba speaker. So Yoruba is spoken in Nigeria and some other areas in Africa. And then I thought, well, that's interesting, because one of the performers we're working with in Birmingham, we'd done a really interesting project with them called Yoruba Sonnets. And so then I crafted what I thought was going to be a very exciting project around the Lekan Babalola and his ensemble, sort of jazz musician, percussionist, working together with the kids in this school, and that would then yield a concert in the Sheldonian Theatre. So that's going to be very exciting. Unfortunately, then the coronavirus hit and we had to abandon it. But what we've still done is that we were working also with a poet, and she knew a Yoruba speaker, a young poet who'd been at an Oxford school. And so they got together with 8 students in Brampton Manor Academy, and the students wrote poems called Remembering Yoruba. So we're going to be publishing that on our website as a pamphlet to show how you can use your community languages and languages that you might, that your grandmother might be speaking, and that you can find out about, and that you might remember yourself if you came from that country at some point, and that could then become part of your identity here in the UK, and that this was something also incredibly enriching that other people who have perhaps never had anything to do with Yoruba could find out about and get involved in.
It sounds amazing, or is it is this relevant to our to anyone to candidates who are applying to study, French or German or Spanish or Italian or Russian or any of the other languages? How does this, is it important for them to know about this sort of stuff?
I think it is, and I think it's actually in some ways part of all the discussions that are going on at the moment about thinking where, for instance, what is our colonial heritage? I grew up in Germany, where there have been, ever since the war, but in different phases, discussions around what Germany's responsibility is, and what the responsibility of younger generations is towards people who were murdered in the Holocaust. A lot of discussion around that, around the heritage of the country and the extent to which the younger generations, are they responsible? Should they feel guilt? My own feeling is not particularly directly responsible, not guilty, but it does mean that you've got a very direct line of communication really with generations that were involved, and that had you lived at that time, probably actually you could well have been guilty yourself of the crimes that people in the past committed, perhaps just crimes of omission. So I think what's always struck me is that in the UK, there hasn't really been the same sort of interest or educational work around racism or colonialism. And I think the kind of sort of, as it were, deafness towards other languages is part of that. The sense that everybody needs to speak English, that that's the only language that matters. We're willing to embrace multiculturalism, but actually other languages are unwelcome and are simply not heard. So the University of Oxford sees itself very much as an English university, and yet people speak all sorts of languages in the university. Oxford has about 20% in primary schools of children who speak other languages. Those languages are hugely valuable, and we could be using those, we could be benefiting from them economically, we could be celebrating them as a cultural value. They're a source of creativity, as I was showing with Yoruba. And I think what the project for me has done is that it's turned me from somebody who was always only thinking in terms of sort of, English and German, because those are the two languages I grew up with, always in that sort of binary way, always within a European context very strongly, like modern languages generally tend to be seen as a European kind of range of languages without our really thinking about why that should be. But Chinese is becoming much more important. In fact, now there are more people doing Chinese A-levels than German A-levels. And I think the world is changing, and I think languages are very much part of that. And they're a way of discovering dimensions that we might not be that conscious of, but that are actually enormously exciting, because each language is a kind of pathway into another culture. And it might be a slang language, it might be sign language, it might be Yoruba, it might be a dialect of German or French. I think sensitizing ourselves to that diversity and to the value of it, and discovering our own linguistic heritage and being interested in it, I think is actually really, for me, it's been enormously enriching, because I suddenly turned from feeling that I was actually rather a poor linguist who'd never bothered to do enough with French or Spanish or whatever, into thinking, well, actually, the French that I have done has been really valuable, and actually I do value it. Going to Italy, I love saying ciao, and going to Spain, I like being able to sort of try out a bit of Spanish. And I went to a conference in Senegal as part of the project, because the British Council was organising one there on language and development goals. And found myself in a taxi having to dig out my French because it wasn't at all clear where we were going. I found that actually I could negotiate what I needed to with my rather rusty French, and that was quite a pleasurable experience. But I also discovered that certain languages that I didn't really remember having really had much to do with, like Ladin in South Tyrol. I now have a graduate student who's working on the languages of South Tyrol, which there are 3 main languages, and it's proving an enormously interesting project. I used to go skiing in South Tyrol, but I was never that interested in the languages. But now I've sort of realised it's sort of part of my history, I suppose. And I think that's my grandmother was Scottish. I've got more interested in her Scottishness. I've also got much more interested in bird language, because our project is a strand on bird conservation and birdsong. So I think there's a huge amount to discover in languages beyond the ones you're formally learning, and thinking about the context that you might be sort of taking that into and in future times in your careers. We've done a lovely careers video as well. All sorts of different careers.
And so that's on the Creative Multilingualism website, is it? If people want to look that up? Okay. Yeah, just put Creative Multilingualism into Google or something and you'll find it. So my last question, Katrin, it sounds like this project has changed your view of languages really thoroughly. Has it changed your view of how you'll teach once you come back?
I think so. I think I've been more interested in exploring connections between languages and the sort of transitions between them. So we teach a lot of translation, for instance, at Oxford, and I've always loved teaching translation, and I've always seen it very much as translating between two standardized languages without thinking too much about that, partly because I personally speak German and English equally, and so for me, being, as it were, a native speaker of both languages has been something that I've sort of taken for granted, and my sense has always been that it's a sort of binary thing. You translate from one language into another. One of the projects in our creative multilingualism work is called prismatic translation, and that's led by Matthew Reynolds in English, and he's been exploring what happens if you view translation as creating new meanings in other languages and opening up meanings that are sort of latent in the original, and thinking of translation as creating a new text. And they've done a fabulous project on translating Jane Eyre, all the translations that have been done in many different languages over time since Jane Eyre was published. And I think it's been translated into something like 53 languages or so. But it raises kind of interesting questions, like if you translate the pronoun you, so Rochester and Jane Eyre address each other as you, if you translate that into a language where you need to distinguish between the polite form and the impolite form, and the sort of formal and informal pronouns, at what point do they stop using the formal pronoun and use the informal one?
Yes.
And so the translator is going to have to create that moment, which is enormously meaningful for the reader, but actually it's not part of the original, because in the original you can just sort of seamlessly move from one to another. And of course, if you go to, for instance, if you go into Japanese, then, you know, how do people even move, and how do they greet each other, and so on. So the more distant the culture is, the more interesting some of the questions that arise. So I think I now see the languages that I know much more in a bigger context, and the whole process of working between them as a much more exploratory one, rather than as one with sort of given finished languages. I've also got much more interested in new words and how they come into the language and so on. Poets work with them. And I think that would be something that in my teaching I would be interested in, also finding out what languages students know that might not be the ones we teach even in Oxford, but might nevertheless actually contribute some really interesting insights into how we view the languages that we're learning.
Thank you very much. And I think this goes to show that creative multilingualism is an amazing thing, and well done for having done it and come back to us soon.